Hello, I am Radagast with Global Mission of Peace TV, and this is Mystic View, and we are joined again by Dan Winter. Welcome, Dan.
Hello, nice to be here.
And of course, I have my co-host, Shelley Evans. Hello, Shelley.
Hello, and hello, everyone.
All right, so why don't you take over the questioning for now, or the beginning of this, Shelley?
Well, I would love to, because what I have burning questions about is how temple and magnetic field relates to Dan's work. And I know you have a lot to say. You could just jump right in.
Well, yes, the concept of what is a temple or what is a sacred space or what is a church is very instructive scientifically to learning how we grow our aura and get close to becoming immortal, I suppose. The famous recent book, Temple in Man, Schwaller de Lubitz, with Robert Lawler's work, showing the geometry of temple based on the geometry of man, it all implies the real science, which is how you make a centripetal, implosive, and bioactive electric field, which is how you create the kind of cocoon of charge that is your boat to immortality. Now, the way we usually tell the story is from the sort of Zecharia Sitchin motif that the word "I will raise a Shem unto the Lord," from the word Shem and Shaman and schematic and alchemy and chemistry, which he translated to mean high word firestone. We know that word, Shem, became the word for the altar in the church. And though the concept of temple was a Shem. And we now know what a high word firestone is, which was Sitchin's metaphor. It's literally an implosive capacitance, literally, transliterally, access to a black hole. So everywhere you see the word Shem or even temple, you can think, for electrical engineers, that means access to a black hole or access to implosion or access to centripetal force. What that meant in the case of the Ark of the Covenant, for example, which is an example of an altar, was a capacitor of golden ratio proportion, gold on the outside and hardwood acacia, which had very high dielectric. So you got this implosive centripetal capacitance, and that's enough to contain non-destructively radioactive materials and also ignite the spark, which enables the production of gold powder. So just an introduction to the concept of temple is to build a bioactive electric field. And we have all of that info at bioactivefield.com, and our plasmatechnowtherify.net is a wonderful example that maybe we'll talk more about.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll come back to that. So that just brought a couple more questions to the foreground here. Number one was the cocoon idea, which is such a useful metaphor, but also I've heard you speak about that even when it comes down to the shape of dolphins, for example. Is there anything that...
I mean, cocooning or the wrapping of the mummy or the wrapping of the swaddling clothes of the child, that obviously correct, successful compression is the prelude for what turns the cocoon into a butterfly. And the dielectric function of the wrappings of the mummy bandage, the natron salt was the dielectric content which made the capacitance implosive. And we know that mummy powder was served in every pharmacy in Europe for 300 years, but now we know why, because it was of the gold powder content. And it wasn't because the Egyptians who were mummified had eaten so much gold powder, but it was also because that the electric result of the mummy bandage transmutes biologic living tissue to a rhodium iridium gold powder amulet, as David Hudson and others know, that the transmutation of biological material into a gold powder amulet with implosive capacitance, an example being the creation of agricultural ormes with alkaline fed to deep seawater to milk the agricultural ormes out of the deep sea. So anything that makes capacitive implosive generates that rejuvenation force and the monoatomics and all the resultant rejuvenation. And the cocooning was part of that.
So if we went back to the cocooning and did this meditatively, with thought, using thought, and could get down to that implosive, go ahead.
Well, yeah, you see, the idea is that it's all about rebirthing, and that's as we were just chatting about rebirthing here, that if you get the pressures right, all the memories can converge to one point, and then they are sorted, just like a good fight in an Irish pub. And, and so this idea of getting the pressures converging concentrically is called phase conjugation, or fractal, or onion-like, or cocooning-like. So yes, during the perfect meditation, your brain waves make the perfect caduceus, golden ratio, EEG, alpha to beta. And also, obviously, if the temple in which you're sitting is centripetal likewise, then the cocooning, the implosion is complete. And in 3-dimension, obviously, that's kind of like a rose. Or it is like, geometrically, the infinite stellation of the dodecaecosa.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how is that affecting, if we approach it this way, how is that affecting the Schumann resonance, or the frequency around the planet? Because so many people are talking about how that is being altered. And yet,
well, that's on the cover of my new book at fractalfield.com, that I was the first one to discover the actual frequency of the Schumann cascade, in spite of Greg Braden's apparent confusion. The actual frequencies of the Schumann harmonic cascade, 2.78 and 7 and about 13 hertz, but it's on the equations I cover, accurately, almost exactly, are what's called a phase conjugate pump wave, which is to say the only way out of chaos. So actually, to fix the Schumann harmonic series, we know exactly how to do it. The frequency signature of the EEG and the frequency signature of the Schumann are exactly the same. The alpha to beta ratio is golden mean. And that's called the phase conjugate pump wave, which is basically a picture of the caduceus from Hermes, which means that all of those wave systems are trying to get that implosive compression correct. And the reason that Gaia is negentropic and self-organizing is the physics of the Schumann harmonics imploding. So to know what a phase conjugate pump wave is, which is a cascade of waves going down to a 0 point in the caduceus picture, that's what creates the implosion, and that's what creates negentropy, because it creates communion with the center point, and that center point is the Planck length in time, and that's what my equation has proven. And we took those harmonics, which are also brainwave and Schumann, and those are the low frequencies we feed to the plasma of Therify to make rejuvenation in biology, and it's working. So we know we're right. So the Schumann harmonic it's not as a matter of one harmonic increasing slightly, as Greg Braden unfortunately oversimplified. No, the actual physics is the Schumann harmonic cascade has to complete its harmonic inclusiveness. So all the frequencies lock into that golden ratio completed cascade inclusively, only possible with constructive interference using golden ratio. And the harmonic inclusiveness of the Schumann cascade measures how close or far the Earth is from being self-organizing. And the proof actually is a professor work in Florida there who developed the power spectrum of trees to show that when the tree harmonics completed the Schumann cascade, the tree was emerging from disease. So that's a very important work on, and the physics of peace, for example.
Mm-hmm, the physics of peace. And I'd like to come back to the Therify and the plasma immediately, but just one last question with regard to meditation and visualizing that kind of pure phase conjugate negentropic collapse. Would it be fair to say that we could visualize that as the jitterbug, right? That imploding, but by perspective, by your perspective, then you're seeing it from the inside, so it would appear to be expanding.
Well, perfect collapse is the right issue, and both Nassim and I now are teaching this. I started it. Was that when the jitterbug transmutes the cube octa to the ecosa, that is the physics of superconductivity, which is implosive collapse, because that traverse path is the first time you make golden ratio when you make implosion to center, which is what superconductivity is, which is what happens to Daniel Wrigley's DNA with his near-death experience. And he could feel everyone's emotion. He became superconductive in your DNA. So that implosion path, if you were to talk to an electrician about what that means, it means when the cube, this is the cube octa here, is a tetrahedral stellation, so it's basically a tetracubic structure. When the cube is tilted at 32 degrees and embeds in the dodecahedron, which is in the green center of the Star Mother kit, goldenmean.info kit, you have the green 2 tetra in the blue cube in the center. The blue cube is tilted at 32 degrees, the chin angle is sinks, and that's when the cube rotates and blinks 5 times and becomes pentadodeca. And that's actually the completion of the Merkaba experience, and you go from the cubic symmetry, 7 spins, to the pent symmetry, 5 spins, 7 spins, inside, 5 spins outside. And that's the Anu, and that's how the heart of the sun, the heart of hydrogen, the human heart is literally electrically braided. And that's the braid algorithm for DNA as well, 5 in the thread and then 7 in the braid superpositions.
And so we come back to the temple and the idea of repenting and adding in then the X.
The pen has always been a metaphor from witchcraft to repent and be saved. It's a metaphor for creating a symmetry structure which enables implosion, and that necessary implosion then means that only the shareable wave will survive. So whether you're a witch or an electrician, use a pentacle for the same reason, to create implosive centripetal force, and that will initiate the sorting phenomena where only the phase coherent, which is pure intention quite literally, can survive.
Yeah, that is so cool. I am really interested in the Therify. I'm interested in the evolution of plasma.
Well, 99.99% of the universe is plasma, so we should be interested in what it is. It's basically a cloud of charge, which is also exactly what your aura is, which is the only thing you're going to take with you when you die. So it's very appropriate that we should be interested in plasma. And cold plasma is something, because normally plasma is a cloud of charge, electrical charge, and that cloud is normally held together by heat. Now, if you can hold a cloud of charge together without heat, you have what's called cold plasma, which is rarer, and your aura is a good example of cold plasma. So if you have something that's centripetal and doesn't require heat, and note that plasma tubes at Therify.net, they spontaneously get cooler, exactly as your wound does when the bleeding stops in the center of that field. So making a centripetal force is what holds a cloud of charge together, and that's how your aura travels. And so you make that centripetal field and you trigger rejuvenation, quite literally time reversal. There's a lot about it at Therify.net. It's very powerful.
And so using or having the blessing, we'll call it, to be able to access your Therify device, which I've had only one experience, and I'm looking forward to many more. But if we were to use that for the purpose of, say, long distance healing, the heat produced by the mind, right? You referred to it as interferometry.
Well, interferometry is another name for all of physics. Interferometry just means wave interference, and there's no other subject in physics, period. So pretty general term. But phase conjugate interferometry is a very particular kind where you interfere the longitudinal component of the EMF at a distance, the scalar wave, the Russian woodpecker. It's literally the physics of flame in the mind. And because the longitudinal, which is, remember, let's finish the metaphor. Most electromagnetics, the wave is up and down. It's called transverse. But if you send that wave instead as compressional wave down, which is a longitudinal electromagnetic, longitudinal EMF, then that wave is superluminal, faster than light, and can go through just about anything, exactly the way we measured Ingo Swann heating a thermistor with his mind at a distance, the way the Cherokee and the Bon Po light a flame with their mind. And we now know the brainwave power spectra to do that. It's called phase conjugate. So what you do with the Therify is when you create that field, we find that indeed we can do healing at a distance. In fact, my friend Mike was just telling me minutes ago that he can feel it every time the Therify is turned on anywhere on the planet. He had such profound experiences with it. And many have reported feeling the presence of the field simply by watching it at a distance over virtual video. So we know how that works. It works because the presence of mind is literally longitudinal wave mechanics, which is faster than light, exactly like gravity waves, and has to do with gravity physics. It's very profound. And it fits all the spiritual metaphors.
Right.
So healing at a distance is very much something we're about. And in fact, group mind, collective bliss experiences, all that kind of thing, definitely we're beginning to play with plasma, with Therify. And it works. It's amazing.
And so for people that wanted to join you in that play and participate, would they go to the Fractal U page? Where would they go if they want to, or to the Fractal University? What was it, Dan?
Well, fractalu.com, we started that teaching, and there's a bunch of great courses there, and we're just about to launch another series of courses there. But in the meantime, the obvious next way to play is to link the Therify centers, these places which have the plasma tube, or really any sacred space, but doing with the Therify centers. Therify centers are very active now in New York, north of Sydney there. We're installing in Paris this week, and London in a couple weeks, and the Prague install went great, and they're installing Bosnian Pyramid, tomorrow, actually. And we have 2 going to South Africa, Canary Islands. So this is going global. And, eventually, very soon, within a matter of months, we'll do some global hookups here. And this will be great global collective mind bliss kind of experiences. And we're just starting that. And it's wonderful fun. And we love it if people join us.
Yeah, well, I definitely look forward to joining you in the bioactive field generator and participating in all of those things. I see, Rad, you look like you're ready to jump in here, or shall we continue?
Oh, sure. Oh, again, I just thought we would kind of, play tag here.
Yeah.
And one of the more fascinating recent videos I saw by you, Dan, was about biologic architecture. And how important I really think it is, because, there's a whole movement now of trying to make the world a slightly more functional place. And so you have a lot of people who are starting out, with their quote unquote eco villages. And how often, even I know there are people local around me who want to start new places and put buildings up, and they're bringing the same old architecture, which I consider to be a fail. Because if you're starting from scratch, if you're actually going to be putting a building up, why not start doing it as correctly as possible? And that is, we have to get the right angles out of our living spaces.
No, that's exactly right. And it's, of course, the geometry is very important. And, the golden ratio, we know all about the sacred geometry applied to architecture. But remember, doing the right geometry in architecture is almost useless if the materials are wrong.
Agreed.
And an example of that is, the Russians are famous now. They're building pyramids all over, except they're completely screwing it up because they put in steel and aluminum framing. When the Integratron was built, the ETs told Van Tassel, no metal in there anywhere, no steel or aluminum, so much so they couldn't have a nail in the building.
Mm-hmm.
Because to make the capacitance implosive, and the ancients who actually, the Feng Shui experts of old, they didn't know what electrosmog was because it hadn't been invented yet. But in fact, the whole electric field, the whole capacitance has to be implosive. So the electrical way to know if you've made a building that will cause a seed to grow and a kid to have bliss, there's measurements. We have 3 ways to measure that. It's all at the top of goldenmean.info/architecture. And it basically is about making the kind of electric field that makes a seed grow and turns attention span on in a kid. It's as simple as knowing why, if you put sunlight in a room instead of fluorescent light, you get a dramatic measurement increase in attention span. Because if you know what attention is, you can make it.
Yes. Materials is hugely important to me, and I've been very much into natural fibers, which is one of the reasons why I'm kind of horrified at so many people like fleece, that polyester stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've shared that with some people, and they seem to think I'm a little bit of a material snob.
No, but it's the science. In fact, the professor I was trying to think of earlier, his name is Professor Phil Callahan, who measured the harmonics in the tree. The way he measured that was with a natural fiber, a unbleached hemp fiber, mm-hmm. which is so bioactive, so implosive capacitively, that you could measure whether a tree was going to live or die by using it as the input transducer to the probe on your oscilloscope. And we dump that into a spectrum analyzer through a brainwave preamplifier, and the power spectra tell you whether the tree is alive or dead, whether it's feeling the Schumann harmonics. It all started because the hemp fibers are the best capacitor on the planet, which is to say the highest dielectric, the most vital DNA. So, we say that Steiner had it right. The kids should only ever touch natural materials, natural fiber, natural stone, and natural wood. And the kids should never even touch plastic or metals like steel and aluminum. And the physics is simple, because if your aura cannot embed the material, you cannot steer it with your charge envelope, and it will never literally be part of your body.
Excellent. It's funny, I had a thought, and then it escaped me listening to you. Hemp. I'm a musician, and I'm a bass player, and I also like to play guitar. And I recently, a couple of years ago, found hemp speakers. And once I heard a hemp speaker, I still have a few paper speakers in my life. But as a musician, and hearing the response of hemp, to this electronic signal and how it reproduced it, how it, as it acted as a transducer, I was thrilled, because I could hear hemp sing with it.
It's actually capacitive. You know, when we modified speakers to be bliss-inducing, it's at goldenmean.info/biophoton. We took a ceramic wafer. We put implosive piezoelectric across it during the moment of crystallization. So we have a highly implosive ceramic capacitance, the same capacitor as Purify.com that we use to trigger seed growth. And then we epoxy that ceramic, which is implosive capacitive, to the surface of the speaker cone, including even on headphones. And so it's basically a capacitor, a crystal capacitor on the speaker surface. And the piezo or the phonon geometry is triggering the implosive capacitance. And this thing was ringing your DNA and your hair standing up. And hemp is approximating that because it's a crystalline geometry of the DNA itself.
Well, what's interesting, again, kind of like almost like a mystical perspective, is that with paper reproduces, but it's almost as if paper is feeling like a slave to the process. Where with hemp, I feel it's actually is in some bliss mode.
Well, it's the conjugate phase discipline of the crystalline geometry of the DNA itself in the hemp. So and we now know exactly how to treat that to make blissful speakers. In fact, if anybody's out there in the speaker building, we have a proposal to make bliss speakers that can blow your socks off. And we've already tested some of them. It's amazing stuff. We just never got around to commercializing, but it's powerful.
Yeah. And then I was also having a further meditation. I was thinking about how hemp doesn't mind being harvested. It has a very quick cycle, and it seems to like to join us in life, where trees like to stand. And so in many ways, the production of paper is kind of a non-blissful process.
Well, it all has to do with how the coherence of the capacitance is maintained or destroyed by the manufacturing process, actually. I just have this image of my friend running down naked in the hashish fields of Morocco toward the German submarine and having this bliss experience because the female plant's pollen is absorbed through the skin at the right phase of the moon. I mean, there's hemp stories that just, we could have fun with those for days.
Okay, now another question or little path I'd like to pursue is, how words affect us affect our psychology. And this is something I had shared with Shelley, was like, we have, quote unquote, the laws of physics. Okay. I really see them as the ways of physics. And I'm going to use two examples. One is Torah, the law, and one is Tao, the way. Take the RH out of Torah and you have Tao. Take the monkey out of Torah and you have Tao. And what I said to her is, I said, if people would see the ways of physics, and rather than the laws of physics, they would see the intelligence and the consciousness in physics as opposed to laws. What do you think about it as a semantic concept? Well,
remember, the universe is profoundly lawful, and understanding the laws of physics is to understand the laws of waves only. It's all about pure principle. And so words, we know, were originally an attempt to capture the symmetry of charged donuts called torus, like the Torah. And the torus donut phase angles, we know, is the physics of the origin of Hebrew, goldenmean.info/DNA ring. And we also see there the origin of Sanskrit. So clearly this was an attempt to capture the tilt angle of charged donuts that you blow like a smoke ring from your optical cortex when you hold one letter at a time, ancient Hebrew or Sanskrit, which control the tilt angle, and then you blow that smoke ring. And if the arrival of those smoke rings at the center of the room is conjugate in the sequence of symmetries, which is what the Hebrew letters in ritual, like Ophanim and Noken, were, then the letters, which is the blown smoke ring donuts, arriving at center implode, and that literally blows the doors off the room and changes the air pressure in the temple, because the physics is that is what it means to cast a spell.
Well, just to take my metaphor a little further, in many ways I see law as almost a tyranny of where, just let me finish, and the Tao or the way as a form of love.
Well, it's more simple. Pure principle is the only thing that inhabits the universe functionally. So if you can live inside the pure principle of wave mechanics, now you could call that the law, but it's essence actually. And so at the moment of implosion, like when you're living inside a lightning bolt, like at the end of the movie Powder, or when you're having Kundalini Tantra or bliss, you must think only a shareable thought, which is literally pure principle or essence. And therefore all of DNA is therefore interested. And so you've identified the essence of what is the law. So learning to distill pure principle out of any human experience is beautiful. Now, superficially, the laws of physics as they're written down, a lot of them are mistaken, et cetera, and childish. And of course, human political law is 99% crap. But the pure laws of physics, which is the pure principle of wave mechanics, is how you inhabit the universe with your mind. And identifying with those is precisely what it is to survive bliss and death.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah, and that's great. And so referring to those Hebrew letters that you were just describing, and bliss being the function of DNA, and how that, I mean, we see that in our nucleotides. Isn't that a direct translation?
Well, remember, when we're saying bliss, we effectively mean charge radiance. And charge implosion always precedes successful charge radiance or charge explosion. And so effectively, to get yourself charged radiant, we know what happens, that the more you have bliss experience, the more your DNA braid recursion is phase disciplined, and therefore implosive, and therefore bends the light, and your aura gets bigger, et cetera, et cetera. So it is literally electrically correct to say that the bliss is the purpose of human existence, because getting a big aura is the only real purpose, because if you don't do that, you don't take anything through death, and you don't steer stars and graduate from kindergarten. So it is about the bliss, but the physics of bliss is basically getting your biology charged radiant, which starts with the implosion, which is the discipline of the hygiene to know what grace is and absorb charge. And the mechanism of how that gets into DNA is well articulated, that the power spectrum, the EKG we call heart coherence, measurably induces the DNA braid coherence. The study Glenn Ryan did at my suggestion, all at fractalfield.com/coherence. Remember, I invented the term heart coherence because I invented the mathematics to measure it, which now will be in heartstring.com and iThrive.com. So heart coherence causes your DNA to implode, and that, when it has phase discipline, recursive, your DNA thickens, and your DNA then bends longer and longer light waves, which is the physics of why the Sufis correctly say, only love bends the light, therefore only love creates. It's accurate physics.
That's beautiful. And then we're back to cold plasma and your aura.
It literally, matter is light that went in a circle, and to get light to bend into a circle, you have to have a centripetal force, love or perfect embedding. So to bend the light, and your DNA bends the light after you've had some bliss experience, and you can measure that because you start to have dowsing response.
And fa'atun.
If fa'atun, to fatten your aura, fa'atun means to feed atun, feed the sun god in yourself. So, you know, your Jewish mother, your Jewish grandmother is trying to fatten you up, but she's really trying to fa'atun, which is to feed your aura, which is highly useful.
Yeah, and we love fattening our auras. And Rad, you were just doing some sun gazing last night. Was that last night?
Yes, and what's so funny is because I was just going to bring up the S rune in the Elder Futhark, which is the sun rune. And the reason why I bring it up is because in many of your diagrams, Dan, I saw a diagram. It was kind of like I guess it was a Goldamine rectangle, and it was divided into three, and it had what is known as the S rune, or Sowelo is one of the pronunciations. And it's drawn exactly, I have a book written by a runic magician speaking very importantly about the proportions of runes and how you set up the geometry of them. And the rune, I don't know if it was a rune or just how you were showing a wave, was identical to how he says that the S rune should be composed.
That's the sine wave, I believe, within a sphere, right? The sine wave within a sphere, or the caduceus? Is that where?
Well, in the physics of the creation of the letter S, which we animated there at DNA Ring, it's actually the top. You're looking at a particular phase angle for the spiral on the torus. Let me see if I could play that here one moment. So the angle of the spiral on the torus that creates the letter S is an angle that distributes charge in a very particular way. And perhaps I can express that. I guess our internet connection is slow here, so maybe I'm going to stop that here. But if you interfere two waves, and that interference goes to perfect completion, it's beep, 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 beep. And the last thing you hear when the interference goes infinite is beep, 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 an S sound, the S word from the S tone, S word from the stone. And the reason that S symbolizes that, and it meant power in many languages, is because it is the vector direction of the final step to infinite distribution. Cast your bread upon the waters. And so you only hear the S sound if you listen very carefully in your inner ear during Kundalini. You're hearing the S sound because the waves are doing the last step in completing the distribution.
This is the figure that I was speaking about, Dan, that I saw on your...
Oh, yeah. That was there's a ladder. It's part of the Tree of Life animation 3D, too.
Well, that's the S rune in the Elder Futhark, and it also, besides being the Sun rune, it also means wholeness. So it was just, I thought it was interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, wholeness in the sense of when you finalize the distribution, it's like at the moment of death, if you were in a sacred space and your aura could complete that distribution. So suddenly your charge is distributed like the final electron shell of the monoatomic gold. And your aura can do this everywhere at once, perfected distribution. And that literally is the S sound. It's the climax point.
It's interesting how snakes hiss.
And there's a lot about the origin of sounds and power, because the ancient Draco could poison their prey with their spit. So if you could not spit, you were not powerful. So the analysis of the ancient Draco sound S, meaning to be powerful, required your ability to project your spit well, actually. And this was actually part of the Velociraptor biomechanic. And the joke was, therefore, if you were having an argument in Amsterdam with an Orion Queen Mog, you might need an umbrella.
Which makes me think of the spitting cobra and how important a role that plays in Eastern religion.
And that's the other thing, when you move to Europe and you realize that you're going to have to be able to pronounce the deep CH sound, as in Lechem and L'chaim, CHEM, to raise a chem unto the Lord, and you think somebody just burped. But actually, the ability to pronounce a deep CH means access to the black hole in your throat. So, of course, the Europeans will consider you weak if you cannot do a proper chem, because you can't make the black hole in your throat. And CH literally is Shem,
One time I had a client, and she was Welsh, and she was explaining, and she spoke Welsh. And there's I guess there's a book company that we know as Llewellyn, and she was the one who taught me that the double L in Welsh is like a, but it's more towards the palate and not so much in the throat. Like, so Llewellyn is Llewellyn.
Yeah, and the ability to pronounce the L with the proper curvature in your tongue was the way they could tell if you were, in fact, a shape-shifting reptile, because certain snakes can't get the other L shape in the tongue. And so they would actually do that to find out if you were truly of the right ancestry in certain wars.
And then we get to Tolkien, and he kind of he had two Elvish languages. He had the Quenya, which was the High Elvish, and then he had Sindarin, which was the kind of Wood Elven. And he based the phonics and the sound of the High Elvish off of Finnish, and he based the kind of Common Elf on Welsh. including like a lot of the th sounds. I mean, he, as far as like how the language would be sounded, he made the High Elven sound like a Finnish, as if you were listening to Finnish speaking. And when you listen to the Sindarin, it sounded Welsh. And I was pointing it out one time when we were doing a screen share of the Lord of the Rings, and there was Galadriel was speaking Wood Elven, and how much of the th sound was in there. It was very Welsh sounding, and I just thought it was very interesting how Tolkien pursued these things.
And we know that the bird brain pronounces the th differently. For the French do not put their tongue through their teeth and do the th, whereas the Finno-Ugaric origin of the Lord of the Ring Elven there, the Finnish, which we know that alphabet on the side of the ring donut, which is literally the animation I just played for the origin of the alphabet, and the Finno-Ugaric was quite literally Old Draco. In fact, the Hungarians, who were the only ones who could understand the Old Draco language on the cave walls in China, wingmakers.com, which then became the DragonScript DNA at wehavegoldenmean.info/DragonScript DNA. And if you look at the old Hungarian Finnish, the tetracube formation, the letters Enki and Enlil are right there. So I would say that Tolkien got all of that quite correct in tracking the old ring language to the High Draco DragonScript DNA, literally.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Lord of the Ring was about, that if you held that ring properly, which is to say fuse those letters into the golden point of oneness, then all of intention was focused right there, and you could be the director of the human collective intent, the willed mutation of a species. Well, the word Ibi Uru, as in Hebrew, meant crossing over. Ibi, Ibis Iberia, meant the bird brain, and that was the sort of Enki's mother side of the family. And the Uru, Uras, Urup, Ural, was Uru Asa Elem, was the dragon, the Draco, the reptilian brain stem. And that crossing over, which is how a Hebrew translates the word Hebrew, to cross over, between the bird brain and the reptilian brain stem, was what was represented with Enki Nudimud's genetic experiment with us, actually, that we got the best and worst of the Draco, the reptilian brain stem, to Migdal to stand on its tail, to tower. And that's how the snake brain feeds the bird brain. And when that happens, that's the wave mechanics of Kundalini, called Kundalini. And then the ventricle horns grow. And that is, as you see with Moses and Lucifer, the fact that the Kundalini is charged projective. So it is about the bird brain and the snake brain, absolutely. And that is the physiology of Kundalini, quite literally.
I was just wondering whether you were all acquainted with Tolkien's creation story called the Ainu Lindali that he has in the Silmarillion. It's how the Silmarillion opens.
Ah, interesting. Oh, I love that book, but I don't remember that part very well. I mean, the part about the Silmarillion being what I think is quite literally the Girku toy stone fire crystal, whether it's Anton Parks or it's the same story about the implosive crystal, actually. And we now know a lot about the physics of what that implosive crystal is. If you study how the Lucifer's eye, the Kaaba stone, formed in the glass meteor that became the Muslim Kaaba, which was ground up to be the Philosopher's Stone, it's a glass molten, and the foam in that glass is animated with the propagating vaporized gold or PGM metal, to where the atomic geometry then is self-similar to the macromolecular foam geometry, which makes the phase conjugate dielectric massively broad spectral and implosive. The atomic geometry and the molecular geometry are profoundly self-similar. And that's why the Philosopher's Stone, the original projective powder for alchemy, which was D. N. Kelly, was that stone. So that crystalline geometry was the story of the Silmarillion, in my view, the fire crystal of Atlantis. And we did actually a project on the Atlantean fire crystal right out of the physicist Sutton's work with Steiner and who was the sleeping prophet?
Casey.
Casey's description of the Atlantean fire crystal, which physicist Sutton developed, became our toy stone project for the crystallography lab in New York with the famous astrologer Louis Acker, who wrote the book with me. And now this is our isotope transition project on the physics of alchemy, which is my new book.
Well, interesting. I have moved to Floyd, Virginia, and one of the reasons, besides the fact it's a really nice place, is Casey mentions it as one of the places. Well, first of all, there's a lot of white quartz here. I mean, when you go past farms, you see all these big white quartz boulders on the meadows. And he just mentioned it as a very good, energetic place to live. And I have to agree.
I had friends in Floyd, Virginia years ago. That's quite a story there.
Well, actually, we're little Asheville in a way.
Asheville was my former home. Yeah, no, and the quartz in the vein structure obviously is highly attractive to the ley line, so that would be relevant. And it's the formation of the perfect crystal. That's what the metaphor Silmarillion was about. Actually, the Girku, the fire crystal of Anton Parks, which we say was Enki's iPhone, his voice recorder, but it was also a weapon. But the Girku is actually the perfect dielectric. That's what it is.
Well, quartz is, I guess, as a storage unit, is good for recording. But then again, because it can hold, I guess if you can get it to discharge, it would become kind of a weapon.
Well, if you look at the Koski-Frost experiment, crystal propulsion PDF at fractalfield.com/propulsion, that quartz crystal cube made 800 times its own weight in gravity, and all it required was the input of a perfect phase conjugate pump wave. The reason that works is because the z-axis of the quartz, SiO2 helix, is enantiomorphic handed. And so the rotating plane of polarity in the presence of the phase conjugate pump wave actually determines the vector direction of gravity made in exactly the same way the enantiomorphism of the helix of your DNA. So the fact that quartz is helical is the reason it's piezoelectric, which is why it couples along with the shortwave. And that helicity is actually how you translate vorticity to make gravity with a phase conjugate pump wave. It's all the Koski-Frost gravity experiments. And we have business partners for the propulsion project, and it's cooking.
I forget the name of, there's a place in the South Pacific that's kind of the South Pacific Atlantis, and they worked with building with basalt that is kind of in that hexagonal, naturally occurring.
No, basalt is wonderful, very important. And it forms naturally volcanically. Spots in Australia there, and the dolmen are amazing of basalt. Absolutely wonderful dielectrics.
Mm-hmm. And it's almost, I mean, the way it comes out naturally, it's almost like building a log cabin. I mean,
it is, except you have the pent and hex crystals. And we have pictures of that on our website from the Australian work at the Tiagra Airport in Byron Bay, basalt. And the dolmen there, actually, we were basalt, hex, and pent.
So now, when you say dolmen, do you mean like a single standing stone?
Yeah, they were continuous, coherent basalt, naturally formed crystals. And so you have phonon coherence to the long wave right in phase with the short wave geometry of the basalt itself. And basalt is fabulous agriculturally as well.
Now, any significance to, I guess, to the trilithons, which you kind of also see emulated a little bit in the Shinto, sign, two standing stones and a cross stone?
Well, I think the key there was the blue stone. The blue stone was an even more exquisite dielectric than the basalt for the triathlons of Stonehenge. And you could tell dramatically the difference between the capacitance of the blue stones from the other stone. So the blue stone is more akin to the philosopher's stone they found in the streets of Prague. The blue stone was magic stuff. Absolutely.
Now, through you, I have got introduced to Vincent, and bless his soul. And what he mentioned something about the working, and they were using some kind of unidentified red powder. And I was wondering if that wasn't cinnabar.
No, what's that famous meteorite byproduct stone found on the streets of Prague? The reason Kelly could not replicate the alchemic workings, which they produced the purest gold the British Royal Society had ever made, D. and Kelly's heptagonal working in Prague, was because they couldn't get any more of that powder. The mythology was the original powder was actually when the Mad Caliph allowed them to grind up some of the Kaaba stone of the Muslims. But later they found that the the natural meteoritic stones in the streets of Prague could approximate. But it's very metaphorically similar to when Jim Patterson first made cold fusion with the palladium crystals, and then he couldn't get the palladium seeds to grow again. Well, Kelly had the same problem. And it's similar to the problem of the capacitance of the Ark of the Covenant. We had to be the right square wave to make the gold powder stable in the monoatomic state, the Ormes. So that's actually, we just had a regathering here of the Vincent Bridges teachers of Ophanim Enochian, goldenmean.info/Ophanim. And Teresa was she just flew in on her way to Prague, and we brought the Kudai and Claudio from the Torino group, the most advanced Ophanim Enochian working group with Vincent from Torino. And they were all here just about a week or two ago, actually, to decide on the next step for the Ophanim Enochian angelic workings. And there's major plans afoot to bring that back. Including, this will be an outgrowth of the new book which is coming out, which is basically Vincent's retelling with the help of Teresa and others, the true history story of how Shakespeare learned in the lab of D.N. Kelly in Prague to write his plays, including the fusion experience, which is the cube octa symmetry of the hypercube designed from John Dee, which became the geometry of Shakespearean theater. And if you sequence the emotions correctly in that theater, you produce the group mind fusion experiment, which is charge collapse oneness, truly the physics of alchemy. And there's a whole story around that, and that will be part of this new book.
Nice. Excellent. Maybe a little bit of a side question. Have you heard of Anatoly Fomenko?
I think I've heard that. I think I have. But
okay, he's the person who's proposing a new chronology based on very poor record keeping and maybe some playing with time by the Benedictine monks. He part of his problem of his work is he's quite a Russophile, and that kind of biases his work. But he kind of intimates that Rome, what might have been like when Julius Caesar's time, might actually be close to 1,000 years closer to our present time than we know, largely because a lot of the same stories were told by different people, and they kind of spread it linearly rather than stacking them vertically, and therefore creating a lengthening of time. It might be bad science, but his statistics are kind of interesting. And the only reason I bring this up is because of the way Vincent brings out, a lot of the plays by Shakespeare were kind of based on him having some intimate knowledge of the royal courts of that time,
which he learned with D.N. Kelly in Prague and then lived in Italy. Exactly. His name in Dee's diary was Guliamus. I'll think of it.
Well, even in Welsh, William is William.
Yeah, no, but it was G.S. and Francis Garland.
Right.
So every time John Dee refers to Francis Garland, Shakespeare disappears from history and shows up as Francis Garland in D.N. Kelly's notes. And later on, you see that the Tempest is actually the story of the storm from the heptagonal working of D.N. Kelly in Prague to take out the Spanish Armada, which is the physics of Ophanim Enochian on the 7 hills of Prague. We actually have the map.
The only reason I ask this question is because with this plays that he wrote, where these royal intrigues were largely not quite contemporaneous, but relatively recent history for him. So he was able to have some good information. And then I was thinking about what Fomenko said, and I'm going, and Julius Caesar also. Shakespeare also wrote Julius Caesar, which almost like made me think that the whole idea of Rome being about 1,000 years closer to the present than it's in official history, that maybe there was some grain of truth in that. And the reason why he wrote Julius Caesar, because it was a lot closer than his time than we are currently told.
Well, I suggest a follow-up show we'll get Terry on, who's one of the world's leading historians in my view of this Shakespeare story, because she actually knows which wedding that Francis Garland, aka Shakespeare, was at in Prague involving the Italians, and who wore the masks and where he got all the ideas. It's amazing. And it really comes down to a science of the fact that the hermetic intent was conveyed through D.N. Kelly and the whole history of the Shakespearean story. into the emotion behind the Shakespearean play geometries. And the lessons behind that is really the return of the magic of Hermes.
Because when you think about his plays, Julius Caesar is kind of like the odd time period out, unless it wasn't.
Well, I know that, like in Midsummer Night's Dream, when Shakespeare learns to sequence the emotions in such a way that by the end of the play, you identify with everyone at once. That's a conjugate fusion moment. But it's done in the theater at the right sequence of angles. You're actually producing the hypercube, which is, remember, John Dee, with the largest library on the planet, was the mathematical expert of the world on the physics of the hypercube, which quite literally became the Ophanic-Enochian alphabet, which is how you call plasma beings the size of stars, which is exactly what you need to do to call up such a storm. And the meteorology of the storm that took out the Spanish Armada was a one of a time in history. It came out of the North Sea. And how do you call plasma that big? And the romance of that may be somewhat childish, but the physics is important because our tornadoes right now are going unsteered because the giant plasma beings consider us drunk because we're too stupid to talk to them.
I was just sharing with Shelley last night when we were talking about the show how as somebody who kind of comes from a little bit of a Wiccan tradition, but not the actual religion per se, and how we have the nature, the elementals, nature spirits, and then I started seeing how and then I have my own understanding of how you have like what I'm going to call the four three-dimensional elementals, fire, earth, water, and air, all deriving kind of out of plasma or ether. And so these are huge, planet-sized energies that were prior to our own creation. And I won't get into all the metaphors, but then I start seeing that when you can kind of perceive these elementals of the different elements in your garden or whatever, that in fact what we're seeing are fractals of these much larger primordial energies. And they almost get personified and very kind of almost personally communicable at this fractal level.
Well, and you could take that quite literally electrically. What you're calling elementals or, dragons, nature spirits, these are the parts of the plasma field which has succeeded with enough compression to then be temporarily visible, particularly if your aura is evolved or sensitive. So actually, successful compression is named fractality for a reason. So the part of that you see is the part that did the compression, the center of the rose. So you're seeing the center of the rose only. Mm-hmm. And so that's why plasma beings, like elementals, they can propagate non-destructively in places like forests and stone circles. But in metal cities with dead air and electrosmog, these plasma beings would immediately die, because charge distribution efficiency is required for their very existence. And you can learn about that by studying the physics of why ghosts can only appear in certain places. It's the same physics.
I do completely agree with you of why tornadoes are so destructive, because from what I know of, the Native Americans did not experience that phenomenon in the same part of America.
Well, of course, because they knew how to identify with a plasma toroid, which is what a tornado is. And if you embed your aura, and you can see the bioplasmic streamers of the shaman going into the center of the tornado when he's feeling its pain, which is only its place where fractality is bleeding. And so when you feel the pain of that tornado, the tornado is going to follow you around like a pet puppy dog. But if that tornado sees a metal trailer park full of metal buildings, that will feel like pain to that tornado because it's opposite to charge distribution efficient and therefore needs to be destroyed. Whereas a stone temple, the tornado will always avoid because that will feel like part of its body, the same way your aura does if you're feeling compassion.
Well, it's interesting. I was living in a tent at Omega Holistic Institute, because that's where I was a body worker, and when we had Irene approaching us. So I decided to communicate with the storm. And although all around us power went down, people were without power for weeks. And you could see it looked like little mini tornadoes dropped out of the storm and just ripped things apart. All we had was rain.
It's beautiful. We did describe pretty accurately the sequence of steps for the shamanic steering of tornadoes at goldenmean.info/dowsing, which is basically embeddability, the bioplasmic streamers of the shaman. Its instructions are feel the hucha. You eat the hucha, which is to say to eat the anger of the tornado, which is to say to feel its pain.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a being that feels pain because it feels that its inertia is going to be lost. And its inertia will be lost as long as environments are not fractal. If we design sacred space, then there's plenty of room for that spin to inhabit the space non-destructively. And tornadoes don't even need to occur in real sacred space. So actually, it's simple biofeedback that the land is telling us that if there's no fractality in the ley lines of the land, then of course we're going to have unsteered tornadoes.
Yeah, well, my communication with it largely has to do with as a friend and an acknowledgement of its expression, and not asking it not to express itself, but largely where I was like, and remember, friends don't hurt friends.
Well, and it's very famous that you can steer ball lightning with your mind. So that's a good way to practice, actually. That the reason ball lightning responds so well to telepathy famously is the same reason that tornadoes do. Another way to practice is, the plasma toroids called orbs, which will definitely show up if you have a bunch of trees fresh cut down in storage, because you have lots of plasma there. And so those orbs in the same way. So this is all ways of practicing steering the flame with the mind. And this is basically how you graduate to grow up and become a star. And our new flameinmind.com brainwave software will help. It's coming out.
So Shelley, I see you've looked up from your notes. It looks like you might be primed and ready.
I found the notes that were relevant to the bird brain, and then we moved on, and then I found the notes that were relevant to all the other things, and I'm just so much enjoying the conversation that you were having. I'm almost hesitant to turn it 90 degrees to come back to something else, the light, the phase coherent light and laser. And Dan, you were speaking, well, in a recent video, you're so prolific, I don't know how to name that exactly, but what we were talking about was four waves mixing.
Yes.
And part of what you had mentioned there, aside from the coherence, is that the time reversal is always negentropic. You can't. Your example was you can't reproduce rust, but you can.
That's right. It's very important.
The wholeness, right? So. The temple arts, how do you use that? How would they be able to reproduce that?
Well, the way you design a crystal to make gravity is four-wave mixing. Four-wave mixing was a name for the fact that in laser physics, you arrange the lasers to converge exactly like basically a cube. So when the lasers converge accurately in four waves in a cube, think of 4 pine cones converging cubically. And that's how the lasers have to meet to phase conjugate. The first place, time reversal and negentropy was measured. So basically, the pine cones has to learn to kiss noses in a cube, exactly the same way your brain waves do from across hemispheres, 2 pine cones kissing noses. Now, what happens is that the way they converge at the center, they assemble the pressures in such a way as to conjugate or implode. And the only thing that emerges from the plasma at that center point is a wave that achieves perfect phase discipline, perfectly distributable, perfectly shareable, which is to say, total restoration of order. What that means is that the time reversal, well proven in the physics of phase conjugate optics, has one particular quality, as you mentioned, which is to say you can only time reverse to greater order, which is exactly what the place between the 2 plasma tubes of Therify.net is doing in rejuvenation and time reversal. So yes, you can only time reverse the rusted steel back to unrusted, but you can't go back to disorder. You can only go back to order. And that has profound meaning for stem cell dedifferentiation. It's very profound. But as far as temple design, it means the same way you scale a Koski-Frost quartz crystal, log functionless golden ratio, exactly integer exponents times Planck length and time, to provide the global scaling to make the cube of your temple implosive. And then you actually superpose the low frequencies of the phase conjugate pump wave, which is exactly Schumann and brainwave harmonics, the low frequency caduceus, and then the whole cavity becomes implosive. A perfect metaphor would be the high perfect dielectric of the Bosnian pyramid, ancient geopolymer, and then he measured the infrasound low frequency phase conjugate pump wave, and suddenly he's got 500,000 people a year coming there and changing the economy of the whole country because they're getting the rejuvenation effect. And now he just bought the Therify and they're setting it up tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. That's exciting. I often think of the temple as relevant to these temples and how to recreate those. I'm always thinking in terms of taking the shortcut. Let's just do it with thought, right?
Well,
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's beautiful, exactly. And in fact, the two brain hemispheres achieve their focus right between the two temples. That's the perfect metaphor. And you know, there's actually proof of that in the biophysics literature that Z.V. Harvelick, doing the physics of dowsing with the American Dowsing Society, measured the fact that the dowsing response is virtually totally eliminated if you put a little piece of aluminum foil right here and here at the two temples because it's the wrong dielectric. So you can prove where the dowsing response originates in the aura, and it's right at the temples.
Right, right. So if we find it in the human body, we would also find it in the cosmos.
Exactly.
So have you put any, kind of thought or direction into that?
Oh, as above, so below. Name for fractality, I am that I am. Yeah. Galaxies have spiral arms just like solar systems. They're all trying to phase conjugate or die. But once you know the cause of gravity, then you can know the cause of consciousness. It's phase conjugation. It's literally the same wave symmetry above, so below. And the more broad spectral the conjugation is, the more negentropic, which is to say the more mindful.
Right. Mindful. Mindfully compassion. Mindful compassion.
Well, it means you can become the center of bigger and bigger tornadoes, which is the only way to grow up.
Right. Well, I am very appreciative to have had this time to share with you. Rad, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Oh, yeah. Well, because it kind of ties in where we were just talking about. First of all, brain hemispheres. And also the rose, which I feel is important. I don't know if you're aware of a series of books written by a writer went by the name of Guru Das. But the book I'm speaking about is Flower Essences and Vibrational Healing. And in that material, they identify as rose as the most powerful of the flower essences. And the interesting thing was that there's a rose called McCarthy or McCartney rose that is a specific for epilepsy. And as the material explains, and I'm not saying this is correct, but the material explains epilepsy is kind of like a buildup of suppressed energy on one side of the hemisphere. It could have something to do with the corpus callosum. But basically, an epileptic fit is an electrical storm of the re-equalization of the energy in the brain. So it's kind of like as this huge electrical cascades cross the corpus callosum into the other hemisphere to kind of get an electrical homeostasis. Your nervous system shorts out, and what we see is what's called an epileptic fit. And he says, Rosa McCartney allows at least a constant, almost like an overrun where that buildup can occur, where there's at least some kind of leakage that allows some basic homeostasis that would not allow for a grand mal seizure.
I had a lady friend who was having epileptic phenomena, and I realized she was resisting her own Kundalini. And that when she could relax enough to have a Kundalini climax, the need for the epileptic seizure was eliminated. I also had a second cousin who had an epileptic seizure on the altar during his wedding, and I saw that he was having an intense bliss experience that triggered the epilepsy. So there's a great correlation between the need for climax bliss and the need for epileptic seizure. That basically the entire body as a plasma being needs the conjugate climax for the sorting and communion of memory. And if there is a conjugate climax experience, Kundalini Tantra bliss experience, ecstasy experience, then the need for epilepsy is dramatically reduced. Now, I know that can be a bit of a poetic romanticization, but there's some great physics here, which is that the rose geometry is actually the electric field of what triggers the low frequency content of the successful bliss in brainwaves. For example, at goldenmean.info/biophoton, when we did the spectrum analysis of the rose oil to compare it with a synthetic, and we saw the low frequency, capacitive, weak electrical content of the proper rose oil was a perfect caduceus. You can actually see the curve there, whereas the synthetic rose oil was not.
Mm-hmm.
So we know the molecular symmetry of the effective rose oil. And I even talked about this potentization when we visited Young Living Essential Oil manufacturing facility in Ecuador during our lecture tours. And so we know capacitively how to perfect these oils. Actually, and we know now that cannabis hemp oils, which are very effective in themselves for healing cancers, if you zap them with the Therify, with the low frequency component of the plasma, Therify.net, they become exponentially more potentized essential oils.
All right. Well, I think I would like to thank you, Dan, for your generosity, your knowledge, and your willingness to spend some time with us, and for coming back again. And I find our last show was great, largely because we let you speak a lot. But this time we came much better prepared, and I think people will really enjoy this.
Oh, it's always fun. It's always wonderful. I appreciate your pure intention, and we're all together here making this a shareable wave, which is what a rose is. It's all perfect. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank you all out there for joining us for a Mystic View, and we'll see you next time.
And thank you, Shelley. And this was a Mystic View.